For many people, Dreamer is still the Supertramp song. It was their first hit, it was a big hit, and it also had all the elements of their sound that perhaps they tried to clone a little bit too much in the passing years.
Dreamer really personified everything that Supertramp represented, and the sound, that whole kind of Roland keyboard, electric piano.
It couldn't be anything else, that's the only song it can be. And then we get this fantastic shift. So playing around with time, moving across the beat, and then the chorus part, again it shifts again. From we finish the verse with F and G, and then we move down to F minor, up to B flat, G minor, then C, and we end on C, so that when we go back to the verse, which is in D, we get that fantastic shift where you think you're ending on chord 1, but actually that's chord 7. We move up to the verse, so I'll demonstrate. So.
You have to remember this was in the days of the Moog synthesizer, and an electric piano was considered to be a little bit basic. But the combination of that, Bob Siebenberg's
example of a really compact song, which is a perfect single.
It's a brilliant, brilliant pop song, because up until this point on the record, the songs have been complex, experimental, mixing elements of prog, jazz, heavy rock, and tinges of pop, but Dreamer's pure prog rock. And they introduced a stronger pop element to their sound with Crime of the Century.
It's a fantastic album. It's definitely the album really that broke Supertramp in the first place. You know, that was the one that really made people stop and wow, you know, who is this sort of thing, you know.
Crime of the Century, whichever way you look at it, was one of the best British art rock albums of its era.
I can see you in the morning when you go to school. Don't forget your books, you know you've got to learn the golden rule.
It's kind of a very atmospheric opening. You've got the harmonica, and in 30 seconds you've got the atmosphere of the album there. And Roger Hodgson's kind of desperate but beautiful sort of vocals, which are very provocative. And the song building behind the intro, which they're very good at. Supertramp are very good at that. They'll kind of bring the intro and the rhythms up from underneath. Before you know it, the song is really kind of rocketing along.
After school is over, you're playing in the park. Well, don't be out too late, don't let it get too dark. They tell you not to hang around and learn what life's about, and to grow up just like them, won't let you work it out.
It's experimental. It's got those quirky rhythm changes where it's sort of building up, and yet it'll break out of one rhythm and into something that's a bit more up tempo.
So in the song School, we get this this riff that kind of starts to fade out. And then we get this sort of a marimba sound going, building up, intensifying. We've got, I think, a vocal on the offbeat, and also a kind of wailing guitar high at the top end of the guitar. The drums come in, the bass starts to move in, it all sort of builds up, and then we go into this massive sort of piano solo. So in the piano solo, we're moving between this kind of free blues sort of jamming improvisation sort of technique and also the very structured melody sort of, I suppose it's to do with the idea of being at school. Sometimes, you know, the blues bit would be maybe the kids messing around, having fun, and the regimented sort of you shall do your work bit. So we get this very sort of structured and very unstructured sound moving between the two sections, but always kind of planned and not just free for all.
There's never a dull moment. As soon as something did stop, another instrument would start, the bass would often drop out and then come back in to stunning effects. And when you thought that really nothing else was going to happen, Helliwell's saxophone solo would come in sort of big and proud and mixed very loud, and again it was another sort of gear change, and it'd be very hard to lose interest.
The changes in the tempo and rhythm of School, I think were, if it was the first album you ever listened to as Supertramp, it was indicative of the way the rest of it was going to follow.
The tempo changes are interesting, but they sort of really let you know that they had prog rock roots. So although it's interesting, some of it sounds a bit dated today. Bloody Well Right really encapsulates everything Supertramp kind of represented, sonically and lyrically. And I wouldn't really call it a heavy rock song, but in Supertramp's world, it was about as heavy as they got.
Bloody Well certainly isn't a heavy rock song. I don't think any Supertramp track could ever be classed as a heavy rock song.
Bloody Well Right is not just a heavy rock song. It's again, it's got pop chorus, the quite right, you bloody well, you know. It's got that sort of, it's not, the lyrics aren't pompous, but they attain to a sort of cleverness that critics of the band, certainly at the time, didn't like. It got up their noses.
Right, you're bloody well right. You got a bloody right to say. Right, you're bloody well right. You know you got a right to say. You're bloody well right.
Bloody Well Right starts with a portentous guitar solo, which makes heavy use of the wah-wah pedal, but that actually stops it from being too pretentious. The verses are quite heavy and aggressive, reflecting a kind of frustration at the English public school system, which was something that Supertramp seemed to have in common with Pink Floyd at that time.
They were obviously listening to a lot of rock themselves, amongst other things, but again with using their sort of recording techniques, and the producer Ken Scott, who was a very, very accomplished producer, an engineer, he'd got just great sounds on the guitar. The guitar and bass make things very heavy and very menacing, and is a great sort of perfect foil for that kind of slightly pretentious pseudo Wurlitzer trademark keyboard sound.
Bloody Well Right was an interesting song in as much as it's a very English expression, something that the rest of the world didn't necessarily know how to react to. Supertramp took that to an extreme on stage where John Helliwell, who was the master of ceremonies as well as the sax player, had a megaphone and he'd go around shouting, encouraging the audience to join in.
We'd play our Pink Floyd at the end of the night, you know, with a head between the speakers, and you'd play your Zeppelin, but Bloody Well Right was one of those ones where you all got together and you had your arms around each other, bombed out of your brains and the drink you shouldn't have been drinking, singing right, right, you're bloody well right.
Bloody well right, you got the bloody right to say right. You're bloody well right, you know you got a right to say.
Maybe it was our little way of having a dig at your parents and things like that.
The album's tour de force, with Rick questioning whether he's made the right choices and sort of seeking approval for this, although actually you know he's not going to get it.
Rudy has a classic sort of adult-orientated rock sound, and the tempo changes at the time were interesting and quite kind of unique, but I'm not sure it translates all these years later. They almost sound like they're a bit noodling and trying to be a bit too clever for their own good.
They were masters of the tempo change, and 9 times out of 10 on a Supertramp record, their tempo changes worked. For me, this doesn't particularly work. I think they'd already got into a format where we know this works and it's going to work, and they were maybe just being a bit sort of overconfident about it.
Rudy was a song that took a motif, the kind of railroad motif that's been going ever since Chuck Berry, and gave it a bit of a new twist. Once you put that into Supertramp's blender and you brought in tempo changes, dynamics, a little bit of taped sound effect, you really had something that was quite unique to them. So although the driving rhythm gave Bob Siebenberg a chance to stretch out, and I don't think he's ever really been given the credit that he deserves. Funny enough, he's American, so anybody who thinks that perhaps it's American sound, maybe that's where it comes from.
I wouldn't say it's Americanized, as more sort of, it's got hints of Las Vegas, and it's the orchestra, it's the strings are very, very cheesy and very syrupy. Even though it's a very good string arrangement, I think this makes it too cheesy, too Las Vegas, too kind of Showtime. There's like a little wah-wah guitar, kind of whack, 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 that comes in as well, which also makes it incredibly cheesy, and it actually starts to turn me off slightly.
Rudy's another Rick Davies song, and they're just like Asylum. It employs his favourite styles of jazz and R&B, and therefore, of course, it's going to have a slight American feel to it, but never is it too American, because Supertramp just never sounded American.
Supertramp had obviously seen where their market was going to be highly successful, or at least suspected it, and they went for the throat. They went for the American market, and good on them. They succeeded where many, many other bands didn't or couldn't. So I don't think you can turn around and say that Rudy was too American. Supertramp were a band that America took on board, and took on board, you know, open-heartedly.
Sometimes Roger Hodgson has been compared with Steve Winwood, and Hide in Your Shell, you could very much hear Steve Winwood perhaps writing and singing. And interestingly, it was a song that came together when the band were routining Crime of the Century in an old farmhouse in Somerset. That was one of the later songs to come together, but it's one that's proved very enduring.
Hide in Your Shell is something of a hidden gem, but for many Supertramp aficionados, it's actually their favourite track. It's a brilliantly constructed song by Roger Hodgson, which brings out something of his darker side as he's pining for some misguided object of affection, we don't really know what.
It kind of opens with the desperate angle, the very sort of comforting, desperate angle of his vocals. And the song is building, and there's a real drama in the chorus, a real sense of sadness. And the song is always building towards the end, where it kind of explodes. With the end section, it's just waiting, it holds back, and then it just lets go completely, and it goes in a straight line.
Hide in Your Shell is a wonderful example of Roger Hodgson's sort of songwriting. almost melancholic in a way, but not the sort of song that all ended up in the doldrums. But there was just that hint of melancholy to it, especially in his voice, very distinctive voice, wonderful voice.
Yeah, it's not my favourite song. It's very English, very cute, very English, kind of almost bordering on self-indulgent, but not quite. Lyrically, it's, you know, as strange as any other Supertramp songs, because lyrically, if you read the lyrics, it's quite hard to sort of understand what they're actually sort of saying. Somehow it hangs together, and just slightly humorous without being kind of frivolous. Again, very good track, you know, on a good album.
Hide in Your Shell is a perfect example of Roger Hodgson's songwriting. It's got everything that he kind of represented as a writer, and the sax solo makes a perfect counterpoint to the melody, and it's a great sax solo, although it does sound like it's played by some American session musician, which maybe doesn't translate quite so well today, but it's a great song and a classic Roger Hodgson song.
The song is perhaps the first time we see John Helliwell's impact on the band's sound with his saxophone. It brings an extra dimension to the band.
The saxophone is, the way that Supertramp use it is almost a bridge between the two styles of music that you've got going on there. You know, you've got this very raw, bluesy, kind of jazzy feel, and then you've got this very sort of English kind of poetic, you know, very sort of sincere, serious sound, really.
John Halliwell on the saxophone provides this wonderful supportive role where we get a vocal melody, and then the gaps that the vocal melody leaves, he fills with this very simple yet wonderful counterpoint. So we get this from the vocal, and then the saxophone comes in with, and then we have the repeat.
His sax breaks were fantastic in every Supertramp song, but because of the melancholy feel of the vocal phrasing on Hide in Your Shell, I think that when I say that the song offers hope, that's come from the sax sound.
Helliwell was never liked by other sax players. He wasn't a jazz saxophonist. He had the ability to really make something very commercial without it sounding trite.
He seemed to have an innate ability to know exactly what was needed at any one time, particularly as they developed. And on the later albums, he was particularly smart at knowing just what they needed and providing that and nothing more.
Asylum is a Rick Davies composition, as we know. It was one that he had a big problem getting right. It was perhaps the song that was most rehearsed of Crime of the Century. Perhaps it was a question of the other guys getting his drift. But certainly once they did, it was a song that proved very enduring for Supertramp.
Asylum is as good an example of the way Rick Davies approached his music as Hide in Your Shell is to Roger Hodgson's sort of approach. It's complex, but never forgetting that it needs a hook to draw in the listener.
Asylum is more of a trademark Davies song, but it really, in this day and age, it sounds very much like progressive rock, and it also sounds very much like an American pastiche, really.
I don't think it sounds too American. Supertramp never really sounded American until Roger Hodgson left, which would have been when Rick Davies' influence really sort of, well, just basically took over the band. Davies has a very R&B kind of voice, and he's very much, jazz music very much appeals to him. Those are two very American musical styles, and they're bound to come through in what he does. Asylum being a perfect example of that.
The actors and jesters are here. The stage is in darkness and clear. We're raising the curtain, and no one's quite certain whose play it is. How long, if only we had listened then.
If Everyone Was Listening is another song of loneliness and frustration by Roger Hodgson. Unlike most of the songs on this album, it's piano-based, which makes it a little meandering at times. But in fact, it's saved by a Beatles vibe that Roger brings to it. But then Roger was always a great Beatles fan.
If Everyone Was Listening was perhaps not the greatest song on Crime of the Century, but it was a little bit of a lull before the storm. You can't have the same amount of intensity all the way through. And I think perhaps that's where its saving grace lies. It's a song that asks a question. Can we save the world, perhaps?
Some detect a sort of a romantic edge to the song. I never saw it as that. I always thought it was more a kind of introvert protest song. More that the world, which at the time it was written, the world was starting to move towards kind of higher tech places. Kind of communications were suddenly, you know, satellites were being put up, etc. And I think it's more of a protest song against the world maybe getting too worldly for its own good.
Is If Everybody Was Listening a romantic song? As romantic as Supertramp probably got. I think it was Hodgson's voice that would always convey that better than anything in the music and the lyrics. It was the pitch and the feel of his voice on some of the best tracks that gets that across, that yeah, Supertramp could be romantic, I suppose, if the mood took them and if no one was paying too much attention to it at the time.
I think the vast majority of Supertramp songs, when you actually got down to it, were actually quite romantic, which is why the band, in a way, had the not so cool image amongst us guys in the 70s. There was a little bit too much lovey-dovey for some of us to admit to.
Now they're planning the crime of the century. Well, what will it be? Read all about.
If any song of Crime of the Century solidifies or exemplifies what Supertramp wanted to be about at that particular moment in time, it's got to be the title track itself. It harks back to the sort of music that they were trying to create on the first two albums, but weren't necessarily succeeding, whether that was down to the personnel at the time or whatever, I don't know. But for a lot of people, Supertramp's musical evolution starts with Crime of the Century.
In the song Crime of the Century, there's a guitar solo, and then things die down, and out of the ashes come this little pattern on the piano. So not only do we get very simple harmony, but we get a very wonderful melody that's running through that. And because it's a constant, it's something that you can concentrate on and then leave. And as other instruments come in, the strings, for example, and then the guitars and drums, the mind wanders onto different things. And with great bands, you can really pick what you want to listen to. And this is the case in Crime of the Century.
It's very sophisticated. There's a lot of complex, very, very efficient string orchestral work, and on this song, they avoid the trap of the orchestra making it sound too kind of quasi-orchestral. It actually is a brilliant arrangement and it works really well.
The album's title track, Crime of the Century, is also its climax, as it sums up in a nutshell really what the album is all about, revolt and revolution, and builds with great passion and intensity towards the end of the song, which finally finishes with perhaps one of the most haunting fade-outs on any record anywhere, and a gorgeous sax solo from John Helliwell.
For me, it's the best song on the record, even though Dreamer's a wonderful little pop song. And School, I think is a great way to open the record. Yeah, it's got epic written all over it, and it's personal taste. But when Supertramp did epic, I loved it.
The title track isn't really the musical highlight of Crime of the Century. It's not as catchy or as accessible as Bloody Well Right and School and Dreamer, which are the standout tracks on the album. But it still sounds good today.
It shows the band at their full force, their full power. All very competent musicians, you know, being driven by two songwriters that were very educated, good songwriters, had traditional songwriting skills, but also were listening to a lot of rock, a lot of modern music. They were, you know, had their finger on the pulse.
When Supertramp came off the Crime of the Century tour, they had to get a new album together straight away. They hadn't really had time to do it. For Crime of the Century, they had 3 months to put the album together. With Crisis What Crisis, they'd only really had a month when they'd been off the road, I think, due to Roger breaking his hand. So they really had to look at what they'd done and say, well, how can we do this a little bit different? So Sister Moonshine, with its acoustic guitar figure, was one way of layering the Supertramp vocals, the Ken Scott production, and all the ingredients, but putting it on a slightly different base. So really what they were trying to do was say, we can still do this, but we can do it differently, and it's just as good.
Moonshine is definitely a Roger Hodgson-led acoustic. You know, it's the 12-string, the classic 12-string, the way he plays it. Very rhythmical, very driving. And he drives the song for a certain length of time, and then the whole band comes in on the underneath of it, like with a lot of their other songs, you know, that you don't hear the rhythm coming, it's just there all of a sudden halfway through the song. And they have an ability to carry a song with just an acoustic guitar, you know, for say a minute and a half, 2 minutes. And you don't miss any other instruments because it's so driving and so positive and so well arranged.
The guitar is actually doing a similar kind of job as the keyboard does in Dreamer and other songs. It's leading the rhythmic side of it so that you don't necessarily need to have a drum beat in from the start of the song, which is great because when the drums do come in, you get that lift.
I said, hey, Sister Moonshine, I'm a stranger to everyone, so
there's always a quirk, always someone on a Supertramp track And this is a kind of song where there's no quirk at all, but then suddenly on the outro, just the last minute or so, it's a very mad Descant recorder solo that, why, you know, how did they think of doing that? Surely the other guys in the band, when he suggested it, went, what, are you crazy? But they went with it, and it's actually very, very effective. And it's, yeah, so it's interesting to hear, and it's nice to hear a Supertramp track without Hodgson's words sort of chugging away, ever present and loud in the mix. It's quite nice to hear sort of acoustic guitars instead providing the sort of main rhythmic sort of backing.
Crisis While Crisis was a classic cover. I mean, you know, sitting in his seat, lying on his bed in the middle of a trash heap, or the world as a trash heap. Very good cover.
And when it comes to the artwork of Supertramp albums, they're always quite a statement, really. You know, you've got this crisis, what crisis? And you've got this guy sat there amongst the wreckage just sipping his cola by the looks of it. And yeah, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheekness about it, really, as well. It's like, we might be serious at times, but almost gives like a bit of a, I don't know, slight comedy element to it. It sort of depicts the contrasts that are going on within the music as well, you know. Sort of a serious thing going on, and then there's a touch of humour with it on top.
If Crisis What Crisis isn't regarded as a great Supertramp album, then Just a Normal Day might be a good example of why.
Woke up crying with break of dawn. Looked out to the sky.
It's actually a very beautiful song, but it kind of lacks the hook that would draw people in with their best known songs.
With the lineup that Supertramp had, a song like Just a Normal Day could possibly sound a little middle of the road. Part of the problem was obviously finding John Halliwell something to do with his saxophone. So if you didn't have something that was cutting edge, then it could be perceived to be a little bit sugar-coated. But Supertramp were clever enough to realise that this would get them a wider audience than otherwise they would have. And certainly when they made their first two albums as a progressive rock group, they couldn't get arrested. So when it came down to sweetening the pill and maybe getting a few of the older listeners listening, they weren't averse to that.
Just a Normal Day is a ballad by Rick, in which he enters into a dialogue with Roger on the vocals. Rick is the seeker, while Roger plays the part of the sceptical melancholic, really. And it's an unusual trait which Supertramp developed very successfully. And it's not one that you hear other bands doing. You can't imagine Lennon and McCartney doing that.
There's a huge contrast between the two vocals within Supertramp. You know, you've got this really sort of heavy, crunchy, bluesy sound in Rick Davies, and then you've got this really mellow, sort of, I don't know, very gentle, sort of passionate voice in Roger Hodgson. And the contrast is massive.
I mean, Hodgson's voice was flawed, you know, and Davies' voice was flawed. They would often sing their songs at a pitch where they couldn't quite get every note, but that was part of the charm. It wasn't mainstream, it was definitely left of centre, left field, and I think that's what hooked people in, and they were clever enough to recognise that.
When they sang their individual songs, those songs were tailored specifically to their own style. But it's testament to the talent that was inherent in both men, that they could then meld both of those approaches, and it would come out as something that was great in itself, which was the Supertramp, the defining, I think, Supertramp sound.
Well, I just don't know the answer. I don't know what to say.
I wouldn't say Just a Normal Day was more easy listening than any other Supertramp song, but it did introduce strings into the sound, which kind of gave them more of a lush, orchestrated vibe. And maybe that took them away from what they'd already become known for, which was sort of pure pop hits at that point.
The orchestra, which they use a lot, is particularly syrupy on this track, and maybe might not be to the sort of prog rock fans liking so much.
Well, I just don't know the reason.
Strings, well, strings, a lot of bands of Supertramps would use strings, and I don't normally find strings bolster the song, but yeah, this is an example of, I think, maybe the success that they'd suddenly had could confuse them, and they weren't quite sure what to do about it. I think this is a good example of that.
Supertramp discovered a formula for themselves, and they worked it very, very well. And some people might say they even milked it. Well, if they milked it, good on them. You know, they made themselves extremely rich out of it, both in monetary terms and musically.
Another Man's Woman was possibly not the most adventurous song on Crisis What Crisis. It kind of went back to the railroad beat of songs like Rudy. But then I think we mustn't underestimate Dougie Thompson and Bob Siebenberg, who certainly on stage and also in the studio were one of the better rhythm sections of the time. So it gave them the chance to stretch out, push the band along, maybe take the focus off the two main headlining guys, and really give a bit of drive to things.
Another Man's Woman is a fairly straightforward rocker that doesn't add a lot to the Supertramp character that we already know. And the lyrics are also somewhat convoluted in contrast to the more precise way they were used in Crime of the Century.
I think Another Man's Woman is a good song. It's good lyrically. It's a fun song, but it deals with a topic that's usually pretty serious to most of us guys. No, I don't think it's an unadventurous song, but it's not anything particularly special either.
It doesn't really work for me. It's sort of a bit too cluttered. The guitar part, which features heavily, is not Hodgson at his best. And then, okay, they get to the chorus and it's suddenly there. Classic Supertramp again. So it sounds a little bit uneven. It sounds to me like they've probably written the song and then revised it because it doesn't, you know, if you listen to the verse, it doesn't sound like Supertramp so much. Even though there's a couple of trademarks, it's much more generic, much more kind of American rock than what you're expecting Supertramp to do.
It suffers again from this, the whole feeling I think that runs through Crisis What Crisis of a band, not 100% certain where they were going. Not what they were doing, but where they were going. They tasted success with Crime of the Century, and everything seemed to have worked superbly there. I have a feeling that they might have found themselves sat there thinking, well, that worked really well, but we've got to take it a step further. But they didn't know what step to take. It's probably the least effective album of the lot, and this probably shows you why.
Lady is similar in style to Dreamer. In fact, in some ways too similar, which is perhaps why they didn't release it as a single. The song is carried along by the characteristic keyboard pulse that Supertramp were now refining. But the piano solo in the middle is really not quite strong enough to carry it.
It's almost like a poor cousin's version of Dreamer, and I think it's already, you can hear Hodgson is possibly starting to sort of parody himself without knowing it. He knows that this is a winning formula, the Wurlitzer electric piano, playing the quaver notes parts.
We have again the electric piano doing the rhythmic part, this sort of very attacked, very rhythmical, and we also have a bass line that moves underneath it. And that follows the chords, so we start off in B minor, move down to A major, then F sharp minor, and back to B minor.
Are you acting? I know what your heart has told you. There's nothing gonna hold you from flying away.
Lady works well, and you know, is it too similar to Dreamer? For me, no. I think Supertramp were a band that were very clever at getting hit singles written and issued, and it was certainly, you know, something that was very catchy.
Just as Lennon and McCartney used to say, let's ride a swimming pool, let's ride a car, I think Hodgson and Davies probably felt, well, we've had a hit, we've managed to end the years of struggle, which they did have, the years when they couldn't sell records. I think they clearly felt that if an album had to have a hit single, why not write it?
I think what you're hearing is a signature sound, you know. I think once a band sort of establishes a style, they move around it, you know, but I think it's very honest that you get something like Lady sounding like Dreamer, you know, it's that you can see a pattern forming, and I'm sure it would be more contrived for them to say, oh, this sounds a bit like Dreamer, we shouldn't do this, you know. I think it's a very honest, very natural kind of thing for them to have another song sounding like that.
Dreamer was kind of a more lighter, lighter version of a single, whereas Lady was heavier. I mean, you can. Personally, I think Dreamer was a much better construction for a single, if I can use them terms. Whereas Lady was kind of, it sounded to me more like an album track, but it had the same driving keyboard lines. Different to Dreamer, different vibe, I think, a little bit darker, I feel.
Give a Little Bit works so well because it's just a joyously uplifting, simple little song.
Like many songs, it's absolutely simple. It's so simple that a lot of songwriters think that's too easy.
Give a Little Bit is one of those classic songs that became the favourite of buskers everywhere.
It was a lot more radio friendly than most of the rest of the album.
I don't think it can fail to put a smile on your face.
So send a smile and show that you care.
Give a Little Bit has been criticised in being lightweight, but any Supertramp fan will tell you that their albums build from the beginning. There's a real dynamic there. They don't put out all their goods on show from the off. So Give a Little Bit was a good way to open an album. And I think also you can hear perhaps an appeal. A lot of Supertramp songs observe rather than engage. And Give a Little Bit is asking you to give a little bit of your love. So they're really bringing you in to the album, to their song, to their life. And so I think it was a twist on a theme, perhaps, that Supertramp hadn't often used.
Give a little bit, I'll give a little bit of your time to me.
The unusual element to a song like Give a Little Bit with the acoustic guitar, you start to see like a folky kind of fusion coming into the music as well, which is something that we see sort of carrying on into Roger Hodgson's solo stuff. So it's something that's obviously very honest to him, something very close to him, and it's just the way he writes. You know, some days he writes on a keyboard and some days he writes on acoustic guitar, but again provides a wonderful contrast.
On this, there's very little production. They stripped it back down. There's no orchestra. The acoustic guitar parts are used very well, and I think I think Hodgson sings it sort of superbly. I think it's a really, really, really great track.
Give
give a little bit. Well, it works well as much as anything because of the lyrics. It's again that very typical of the period Supertramp intelligent lyric. It dealt with a topic that, you know, for the record buying public, and often the people buying it were sort of between 14 and 20 years old. It was a lesson in life, and I think a lot of Supertramp's music was.
Lyrically, the song is really a plea for mutual respect and affection, and to look behind the superficial image to see what's below.
You could see they're getting back on track here. Even in the quietest moments, it's certainly a better record than Crisis, What Crisis, but they still seem to be feeling their way in places, but this isn't one of them. This is where you can see that they're getting it right. And there's almost a feeling on the song that kind of, that happiness is, you almost wonder whether that's because they kind of know that you know, like, hang on, it's coming back.
From Now On is another good example of how technically aware this band are. It's written in F major, and that introduces the mood of the song, but halfway through we want to introduce this kind of cocktail jazz feel, so we very subtly shift key. We modulate into B flat major, and that introduces this kind of jazzy, smoky quality into the music. It's very widely used key in jazz circles, and that helps to do it. But we have to remember with this band, we're actually a rock band. We've introduced the jazz element. We now need to say, hang on, that was an interlude, we're Supertramp. So again, they shift key back into F major, and the song is resolved in F major. But it's very subtly done and very stylishly done, and that's the essence of Supertramp.
From Now On is one of Supertramp's more optimistic songs. It tells about an ordinary person who kind of has a fantasy life, and it's almost as if Davies was playing the fantasy life of a pop star. I say that because it's a song that actually dated back quite a number of years. It had been kicking around when John Helliwell had been auditioning for the band. So you might say either that Rick didn't have the time with Supertramp's grueling tour schedule to write new songs, or he saw something in that song that particularly intrigued him. Obviously, it was worth resuscitating, but maybe he had a little bit of a laugh at the lyric.
From Now On is a really optimistic Supertramp song, both lyrically and melodically. It also features one of the best sax solos on a Supertramp album that is actually memorable, rather than most sax solos, I would say, are kind of not memorable at all, whereas this one, you can actually hum along with it.
Supertramp would use that melancholy feel in a very uplifting way, and if there was an element of desolation to the lyrics of some of their songs, toying with themes of madness and things like that. A song like From Now On is a perfect example of the way, the song slowly builds up and you end up full of hope. Even if, and I'm not saying they do it on this particular track, but they have done on others, they can start out with leaving you thinking, oh, well, this is a bit, you know, and then it sort of, that hope grows as the song develops. What is it about lyrically? I have no idea.
Babaji is dedicated to an Eastern guru, and Roger creates a mystical feel to the song. And he sings the words with a sensuous, romantic feel that's unlike most Supertramp songs.
I don't think Roger Hodgson would deny that he's a bit of a hippie, and there's certainly elements of that to this. But it's certainly not one of my favourite Supertramp songs, and I've really never spent much time trying to figure out what the lyrics meant.
You've got to bear in mind at the time, it was quite fashionable. I mean, the Beatles had spent a few years previously with a Maharishi. It was fashionable to adopt an Eastern sort of influence, kind of mysticism or outright religion. So I think he's sort of basically questioning, you know, should he be there in that mansion, sort of drinking that Jack Daniels, sort of snorting those Class A drugs with babies in the swimming pool outside, or should he be sort of in an ashram, sort of on a higher sort of level, a higher spiritual level? I think that's what the song is about. So musically, it's a very unusual Supertramp song. It's got plenty of production on it, but you don't really notice the production, which is nice. The drums are far less fiddly than on most Supertramp tracks. They're quite linear, they're quite straight. You don't really notice them. Again, the bass is anonymous in a good way, and there's no jagged edges which you're used to in a Supertramp song. You know, just as you think they're coasting along, bush, there's a whole new section, and it's like a little kind of pomp rock or prog rock type of thing that happens, and it's really interesting. But there's none of that. It's much more like he's just speaking to the listener, and it's from the heart.
The solo in the middle has Roger's guitar and John Halliwell's saxophone playing the same notes in unison, which gives it an intriguing quality.
If you want to know what Babaji's about, you'd really have to go and speak to Roger Hodgson, because Rick Davies, who theoretically was the co-writer of songs, hadn't collaborated with Roger since Crime of the Century. Although it's a bit like Lennon and McCartney. They'd written the early songs together, but once they got the hang of it, they'd do their own thing, no matter what the credit happened to be on the sleeve. So Roger was looking for some kind of inner truth, some kind of motivation. And it's said that Babaji, or he's said that Babaji, is some kind of Indian guru or guiding spirit. He's not always answered the question particularly seriously, but then that's his way of laughing things off a little bit, not letting you kind of get too close. But it's interesting that when Rick was asked, basically his answer was, you better ask Roger.
The album comes to an epic finale with Fool's Overture, which is nearly 11 minutes long and is a classic progressive rock piece.
Fool's Overture is without doubt the highlight of even the quietest moments. Musically, it flies all over the place, but then some of the greatest progressive rock did. It's complex, odd time changes, different musical styles, all wrapped up within one lengthy piece of music.
And what a great title. Fool's Overture. It is. It's one of Supertramp's more magical moments for me.
Fool's Overture starts smoothly and then breaks out into this bombastic drum and keyboard driven section.
The drumming must be mentioned here. Superb. Again, it's very fiddly, very quirky. It's, you know, sort of all the trademarks of Supertramp. And in 9 times out of 10 in other bands it just wouldn't work.
Bob Siebenberg, I think, is drumming on this track. I mean, there's elements where it'll be quite standard, but also elements I'm sure where he's actually improvising as well, and I think it's a pretty good show from him all round.
I wouldn't say the drumming works too well because I think it's trying to do too many things and be too clever. Again, this is very much a disparity between what was cool then and what's cool now. It just sounds a bit too rhythmically ambitious and there's a bit too much going on. If they'd have kept a more basic beat, I think it would have worked better and stood the test of time far better than it does.
It's a bit pretentious, to be honest, and having reviewed the lyrics in these sort of modern days, they are not really about so much.
It was a song that they used to call the string machine epic for reasons that are obvious when you hear it. But it's also a song that served them very well on a number of occasions.
Can you hear what I'm saying? Can you see the parts that I'm playing? Rolling man, rockumentary, come on, Sweden. Joker man, Spider-Man, blue heart bleeding. So you found. When I was young, it seemed that life was so wonderful.
Even as the relationship between Roger Hodgson and Rick Davies was starting to disintegrate, they could still come up with a genial song like The Logical Song.
The Logical Song is one of a handful of Supertramp songs that are truly remembered today, all these years later, and it encapsulated everything they represented.
I don't think Supertramp get much better than this.
There are times when all the roads are steep. The questions run too deep for such a skillful man.
There's a neat balance of wry humour and cynicism in The Logical Song. And Roger rattles out the lyrics in time with the instrumental rhythms with a panache that recalls Ray Davies of the Kinks at his finest.
Similar to Give a Little Bit, quite simple on one level and much more mainstream than Supertramp often were. Very accessible by the general public. I mean, a huge, huge song around the world, especially in North America.
You still hear it on the radio. It also, very importantly, won them an Ivor Novello Award, which really gave them some much needed credibility that up until that point they really had been lacking.
If you look back, they'd kind of been following themselves ever since Crime of the Century. They didn't quite match it with Crisis What Crisis. Even in the quietest moments was getting there, and then all of a sudden everything clicks into place with Breakfast in America. And The Logical Song gives them another one of those classic piano-led pop songs.
I said, I'll watch what you say. I will be calling you a radical, unlivable, fanatical, criminal. But once you sign up your name, we'd like to be your acceptable.
Is The Logical Song Supertramp's finest moment? It's one of them. I personally don't think it is. Maybe the whole of the Breakfast in America album, as a collection of songs, is their finest moment. And A Logical Song certainly stands up as one of the best.
I think as far as sales were concerned, the whole of Breakfast in America was the band's finest moment. Musically, not so much for me. I mean, I like the album, I still play it. It's a very inoffensive album. And it's a good fun album to listen to.
The Logical Song almost epitomised what people liked and didn't like about Supertramp. Naggingly infectious, had the dreamer quality to it, but it was also a song that once you'd heard it 2 or 3 times, I feel you couldn't really get that much more out of. And the fact that in the 2000s there was a disco remake of it almost confirmed the fact that you really felt that although the general public latched onto this song, it was one that many Supertramp fans really hated.
The album's title track lies at the heart of the breakup, the relationship between Roger Hodgson and Rick Davies. Roger wrote the track when he was 19, and Rick didn't really like it then, he didn't like it now, and he particularly didn't want it to be the album's title.
A great song, I mean a great track. Very highly unusual. I'll always remember the first time I heard it. I knew it was Supertramp, of course, but I thought, what the hell is that about? It's great. It's sort of very self-effacing, you know. Take a look at my girlfriend. She's the only one I got. You know, the saxophone is wonderful, and throughout the bass and the saxophone play this strange kind of almost vaudevillian type of thing, whereas it's like, but hang on, they're a rock band. What are they doing? And I was kind of almost up in arms the first time I heard it. Well, they can't do that. But then, third listening, I just loved it. I thought, this is brilliant. It's just so unusual. It is a lot of fun. It's them not taking themselves seriously, whereas Supertramp, on the whole, are quite a serious band.
Is Breakfast in America a fun song? Yeah, it's the frivolous nature of the lyrics, I think. The tempo, again, it's one of those songs that puts a smile on your face, but you're kind of smiling or laughing along with the band because of, could we have kippers for breakfast? Mummy did. We've got to have them in Texas because everyone's a millionaire. It's just, they're taking a piss. And it's fun.
Breakfast in America is great fun, actually. It's also one of the tracks that is most remembered from that album, which sold 18 million copies. Now, you don't sell 18 million copies of an album without it being good, and that album really personified everything that the band represented, and that's why it was huge all over the world.
The song was recorded in around 1979, and by this time I think that you can hear clearly that Hodgson is starting to question his own worth as a human being. It's almost like the more money he'd made and more success he'd achieved, he was starting to not hate himself but starting to despise himself. I think this is what this song is about. He's asking the question, is he a worthy human being? And it must be said, I hate to hear myself say it, he's got his trademark Wurlitz electric piano sound going on it, and it's really wearing thin by now. It's like, I really wish he hadn't done it, put it on this song, because it's actually quite a nice lyric and quite a nice song. But it almost sounds like a parody. It sounds like a Supertramp copy band.
The Supertramp's prog rock roots. It's quite an excessive sounding song in this day and age. And after Breakfast in America, really things started to go downhill from a creative and commercial point of view.
I think that Child of Vision has elements of prog rock in it, but to say it's a real progressive rock song, I don't think you can. I don't think you can with a lot of Supertramp's music. It was highly successful commercial pop music.
I think by the time Supertramp recorded Child of Vision, they weren't really looking at being a progressive band. They were a popular band. They'd found their niche. They'd proved that they were number one in a field of one. I don't think people were really looking for progress as such. But of course, when that happens, there's always somebody who feels that they're not really satisfying their own internal needs. And of course, as we now know, it was Roger Hodgson who was looking for other fields. And perhaps he was the one who felt that he wanted to progress, but he wanted to progress on his own terms. Obviously, if you've made the money to live a reasonable lifestyle by that time, you've got the freedom to say that.
They should probably have stopped at that point. Roger certainly thinks they should have done. But in the event, they went on and recorded 1982's famous Last Words, which by then, sadly, weren't quite so famous.
All the sort of classic Supertramp trademarks, the piano sounds, the drums are great, the bass works fantastically on this song. Yeah, it's good.
You can't listen to a band like Supertramp and go, that is a big sounding rock song. They used the instruments in clever, almost delicate ways, and vocals were used in a similar fashion. Clever music, but it wasn't overly clever.
Crisis What Crisis, Crime of the Century and Breakfast in America, I think those were the, for me, were the highlights really. I think then it moved to something else, to another area. I prefer the early stuff, which was around the first two albums, well, the first three albums that, you know, where Supertramp were kind of first recognised. After that, I feel, you know, probably more of the Rick Davies angle was coming through, I don't know.
They still came out with a couple of good songs on Famous Last Words, but things were starting to go awry by that point. Roger Hodgson would leave, Rick Davies would take the band off in a more jazzy direction eventually. So no, they still had there was still something left in the can. It wasn't a complete album's worth of great material.
The partnership between Roger Hodgson and Rick Davies was awesome, and there was obviously tension there. I think that they would probably argue about who got which songs on which albums. But similar to Lennon and McCartney, I think that they needed each other. It was clear.
Roger Hodgson was much more of the kind of neat pop-orientated songwriter in the band, whereas Davies was really more of a rocker.
Because of the two writers and the two vocalists, you know, you get that constant swing in the contrast of the different styles of music that they're touching on.
Well, Roger Hodgson and Rick Davies are two extremely talented songwriters, two fantastic musical talents, and just to have them in one band, I think was quite astonishing.
Supertramp's success was based on a team effort. Obviously, the Hodgson and Davies songwriting and vocals was very important, but the other three guys deserve their credit in really keeping the whole thing up to a standard which really couldn't be ignored, even by the critics. They may not have written the songs, but certainly on stage, where you'd get guys filling in for each other on keyboards, you'd get John Helliwell, who was the master of ceremonies, always communicating with the audience, creating a bond. They all worked very, very hard to produce the final product, and the final product, as we well know, was world class.